Hi, this is a presentation on Mark Twain by Kaleigh Smith. Okay, so first of all, we need to know a little bit about Mark Twain's, or his real name, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, life in order to analyze how his life influenced his more famous works. Okay, so Samuel Langhorne Clemens, or Mark Twain, was born in Florida, Missouri on November 30th, 1835, which means his birthday is in 3 weeks or something like that. To John Marshall Clemens and Jane Nay Lambton, their sixth child born out of all seven. Mark's family experienced tragedy young in his life when his sister Margaret passed away when he was 3 years old, and his brother Benjamin passed away 3 years later. And this was on top of another brother's death, Pleasant, a few years before Mark's birth. In 1839, his family uprooted and moved to Hannibal, Missouri, which was a little port town on the Mississippi River, and is where they would stay during the rest of Mark's childhood, and it would also inspire a large part of the adventures of Tom Sawyer and also Huckleberry Finn. When Mark was only 11 years old, his father died of pneumonia, so Mark had to find work to help support his family. He was hired as an apprentice to a printer's shop in 1848, and then he worked as a typesetter, contributing humorous stories to the Hannibal Journal, which was owned by his older brother Orion Clemens. After a few years, in about 1853 to 1854, Mark moved away from his family in Hannibal and began to work as a printer in New York City, then Philadelphia, then St. Louis, and then Cincinnati. Since Mark grew up next to the Mississippi River, steamboats were an extremely common sight, and it was a universal dream among all the boys to be a steamboat pilot, the ultimate job on a steamboat. Twain was offered to receive instruction to pilot one for a fee of $500, and Twain eagerly agreed. Twain encouraged his brother Henry Clemens to become a steamboat pilot, along with Twain, and Henry joined him. Unfortunately, the steamboat Henry had been working on, Pennsylvania, exploded while they were on the water on June 21, 1858. Mark Twain claimed to have had a dream a month before the accident where he had envisioned his brother's death. This inspired his interest in parapsychology, which also caused him to join the Society for Psychical Research. But pretty soon there would be a spread of grief and sorrow across the country. In 1861, the Civil War erupted. Twain enlisted in the Confederate Army, but then disbanded 2 weeks later. He then joined with his brother Orion, who had been made secretary to James W. Nye, the governor of Nevada Territory, and they traveled across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, even visiting the Mormon community in Salt Lake City. Mark ended up in Virginia City, Nevada, where he had attempted to be a miner, but failed, so he returned to his writing and worked for the newspaper Territorial Enterprise. It was in this paper that he first used his pen name, Mark Twain, in 1863. Mark Twain got restless yet again and moved to San Francisco, California in 1864, still working as a journalist, where he published the short story The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County in the Saturday Press in 1865, which brought him national attention. And that same year, he traveled to Hawaii as a reporter for the Sacramento Union and wrote multiple travelogues. Then, in 1867, a friend offered to fund a trip to the Mediterranean, and Twain accepted. During his journey, he wrote a collection of travel letters, which were later compiled into a work called The Innocents Abroad. On the return trip, he met Charles Langdon, who showed Mark a picture of his sister, Olivia Langdon, which resulted in a correspondence between Olivia and Twain. That next year, in 1868, two big things happened. Mark was offered a spot in the esteemed Scroll and Key Society of Yale University, and Olivia agreed to marry him after her first initial rejection 2 months earlier. Mark and Olivia moved to Buffalo, New York in 1869, where Twain got work as an editor and writer of Buffalo Express. They had their first child, an only boy, Langdon, who sadly died 19 months later. But the next year in 1872, they had their first daughter, Susie. They moved again to Hartford, Connecticut in 1873, and then had another girl, Clara, in 1874, and then their fourth and last child, Jean, in 1880. From 1870 to 1880, the Twain family would stay at Olivia's sister Susan's house during the summer. Susan had thoughtfully built a private study for Mark to work in, and it was in this special place that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi, and other famous works were created. In 1880, Twain made another trip to Europe, which inspired an unofficial sequel to The Innocents Abroad called A Tramp Abroad. One really quick cool fact about Mark Twain is that he was actually great friends with Nikola Tesla around the 1890s. Mark was really interested in science and actually patented 3 inventions. Mark's friendship with Tesla and his interest in science and time provided the basis for one of his stories, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. Mark continued to write, but as he got older, so did his friends and family. Susie died of meningitis in 1896, triggering a period of depression for Twain. His wife, Olivia, also passed away 8 years later in 1904, and then his youngest daughter, Jean, in 1909. Mark Twain himself passed away the next year in 1910. One interesting thing about his death historians like to note is that when Mark Twain was born, it was the same time when Halley's Comet passed by the Earth. In 1909, Mark Twain was quoted saying that he expected to die the next year in 1910, when Halley's Comet would come by the Earth once again. The day after the comet shot by, Twain died of a heart attack, his wish granted. Okay, so I'm going to talk about The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, The Celebrated Jumping Frog, The Innocents Abroad, and A Travel Abroad as his most important works, and I'll explain why. Well, first of all, Mark Twain wrote a lot. Ever since he started when he was about 11 or 12, he didn't really ever stop. He wrote like various articles for different newspapers, multiple humorous sketches, funny stories, etc. He wrote so much and under so many different pen names that Wikipedia says it would be nearly impossible to compile a complete bibliography of his works. Later in his writing career, he still penned stories that had humor and cheeriness, but he also began criticizing society of their acts and anything else he deemed wrong. He didn't really receive any proper education, general or writing, but he did read a lot and frequently visited the library, most likely gaining a better education than if he had attended a public school in his time. But Mark did have this knack of finding people who did have knowledge of writing, or of steamboat piloting as we saw in his youth, and managed to get proper education on writing. Before the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County was published, Mark had already published tons of articles. But the reason why this work is one of his most important is because it was this one that started his fame as a writer. It was what initially gave him his name as a writer. This story was inspired by Twain's roaming of the West with his brother Orion, and by a tale he heard one of his friends tell while they were traveling. Other famous works of his that were inspired by his travelers were The Innocents Abroad and A Travel Abroad. These stories were important and popular because it was a great example of Twain's humor and wit. Twain said that one of the biggest reasons why he published these stories was to show the people how they would most likely to see Europe and the East if he looked at them with his own eyes instead of the eyes of those who traveled in those countries before him. And lastly, we're now on to 2 of Mark Twain's arguably most famous books, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I would say that these works were probably influenced the most by Twain's life, especially his childhood. Tom Sawyer, Twain even said, was based largely on his boyhood while living at the edge of the Mississippi River. We also can see Twain's humor in here as well. This book also introduced the legendary character Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn is the most famous important work done by Twain, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others. People call it the great American novel, and in many high schools they require it as a reading. This book was definitely influenced by Twain's life and his opinions. In Huckleberry Finn, we see Huck struggling with what society expects of him and what he thinks is right about one of his best friends who was an escaped slave. When Twain lived in Hannibal, it was there he really first experienced the institution of slavery, and we can see this influence Huckleberry Finn as well as his childhood, and we can clearly see that in his writing. Alright, that's my presentation. Sorry that was kind of long, but it's also a lot of information to go through very quickly. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this presentation and have a good day.